Now, this one we won't talk about a lot, but I threw it in here anyway. Social traumas are caused by experience with prejudice and discrimination on a personal level as well as a cultural level, and, on factors like race, gender, sexual orientation. So how does society treat you? How do they put you in whatever category? And what trauma does that cause or can be related to? Okay, so we're going to talk about African American historical trauma. A year ago, there's this conference I've been doing for the last 3 years. This year will be the 4th year, where I do a conference called Community Empowerment Through Black Men Healing. I started it 3 years ago, and folks said, "What are you talking about? Community Empowerment Through Black Men Healing? What do you mean, Black Men Healing?" Now, see, unfortunately, if I said we was going to have a conference on how to deal with black men coming out of prison, we would have had the place full. And that's unfortunate. Okay? But when we talk about black men healing, and that's why I said men in general healing. If I just said men in general, I had people in my own community talking about, I remember one black woman come up to me, she says, "Well, why are you always talking about healing black men? If y'all would just act right, blah, 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 blah," and got going on me. And I said, well, guess what? If that man deals with his stuff and become more responsible, guess what? You won't feel obligated to take care of him. Because that's part of your trauma. You do it, you don't like it, but you do it anyway. And guess what? If you don't have to feel obligated to take care of him, then you can take care of yourself and deal with some of your emotional needs, which in turn will benefit our children, which will somehow stop that cycle. She had 2 adult sons, done well, and that kind of stuff. She looked at me, she smiled, she turned around and walked off. So this is a tough deal. And so what I did for my lecture last year at the conference, and by the way, when we first had the conference the first year, what's significant about the conference the first year, we had no money. Folks said you can't do a conference without no money. We pulled it off, we broke off even, and we counted just the registration. If you decide that that's worth doing, you take that chance. And again, now we got folks like the Metro State University wants to co-sponsor because we had it there last year. But we'll get into some, I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So we have the 5 points. Now, if when I talk to the African American community, they say, "Well, Sam, it's more than 5 points." Well, that's true. But these are 5 significant points, especially when you're talking about dealing with folks, especially dealing with African American men, around chemical use and violence. Okay? Now you notice that the first one, and we'll just go on to that one, we have what we call American chattel slavery. And the reason we throw in the American chattel slavery is because this particular slavery was different than other slavery in the history of man. Now, you might be able to find some other representations, but for the most part is why we call it chattel slavery is because basically the slaves were a commodity. They were sold like grain, and they were counted like grain, and they were bred like cattle. So all aspects of humanity was not dealt with this particular slave. Now, in the history of man, usually slavery, when you talk about the slavery of a whole group of people, was due to the fact that we conquered you. We came in your country, we took everything, now you're mine. And folks kind of integrated in there. They might have, they had their own language. They might have not been able to speak it out loud, but they knew what it was. They knew their history. They had their religion. They might have not been able to do it out loud. Might have been some persecution, but at least they knew that. It still connected them to their history, their humanity. It just did. In this case, it didn't happen. So slavery was banned in 1808. Now, it was banned then, but actually the sale of slaves being brought over in the slave trade ended probably about, somewhere in there I got the date, but it was several years before that. And that made it even more imperative to bred slaves because you couldn't get no more coming in, so you just bred some. That's where the term mandingo come from. Mandingo is a male bull. In essence, a male bull. You bred the mandingo man, and you bred the mandingo woman who was, strong, who could have many babies, and they would bring this mandingo around to different plantations and stud him out. So now, stud him out. Now, when you have a whole generation that kind of got disconnected from a community, they go back to what their history is. So if we look at in the urban community, young black men, physicality, sexuality. That's the original history. They were brought here for physicality, sexuality. And you see that in parts of the community. Slavery was abolished I did have it up here. The slave trade, 1808. I had it wrong. It's reading up there. That's what I'm talking about. It stopped. But it was ended in 1865. So we're talking about a whole, almost, 50-some years before it actually stopped, between the time it stopped the trade. Okay? Now, the interesting thing about the 13th Amendment that is real interesting is the 13th Amendment had a clause in it. Okay? Slavery ended in involuntary servitude except for the punishment of crime. So a year later, all the prisons are full in the work camps, especially down south, for committing the crime of just being on the street. TBS, Channel 2, is going to do on February 13th, they call slavery under another name. And they're going to talk about that. So which brings us to Jim Crow era. This is right after slavery. Jim Crow era is attached to down south. When we're talking about that, sharecropping, legal segregation, Ku Klux Klan, lynching. Now, what's interesting about lynching is you have very little records of slaves being lynched. Do you understand why that was? They needed them. He was property. You might lynch one to prove a point, but you can guarantee that one you lynched was not one that either he was a problem, a real problem, might have been a good worker, but he still was too much of a problem, or one you just didn't care much about anyway, just to prove a point. Soon as slavery is over, now we got lynching on a regular basis. And these numbers are not even close. These are just the numbers they was able to keep up with. So now, how does that affect a person's psyche? Now you won't let your boys go out in the woods. There are certain behaviors you see to this day. We don't go no woods. We don't even know why we don't go no woods. Now, some of us do, because, you get all that stereotype stuff, but, go in the woods, didn't really learn how to swim. Some of this has been passed down indirectly. Beat your kid to a pulp so the man won't beat you. I'd rather treat you in a certain way so when you get out there, you'll know how to deal with this. So you won't go do what the young man did and go talk to the wrong person and end up lynched. And see, there's behaviors that folks do now, they don't even know why they do it. Like, for example, in my community, and my mama used to do this. If you would have came up to my mama and said, Sam is a great speaker, you know what she would tell you? She would say, yeah, he's okay, but you got to see how his room is. She would bring that whole kind of piece down, just kill it. Now, if I wasn't in the room and you was talking about it, she'd be all proud. Well, there's a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, and the woman, I met her, and she talked about how the slave women would be out in the field and have a young male child sitting next to her. And the overseer comes up and says, Martha, that Johnny, he's looking strong. He's looking good. And she would look at him and say, well, no, master, he's weak and, he can barely walk very well. And, he's always sickly. Hoping that they let him stay with her a little bit longer. And you still, in the community, you still have that putting down and don't even know why they do it. And I never understood that by my mother. That was like when I grew up, so another type of spread trauma, okay, because my mother never really in my face said anything good about me. But she was telling everybody, my son the doctor, and I ain't even close to being a doctor. I might talk like one every now and then. But you would hear all of this after she died. Oh, your mother loved you so much and like that and like, and then you got to say, I'm ornery. See, I've been ornery for a long time, so now you got to say thank you. And sometimes I just say whatever. Well, you just don't respect them. No, you know what? You don't even want to go there with me. Okay. Yes.
And you may address this later, but will you be talking about what the attempts to heal looked like and how that process of healing was interrupted?
Ooh. Well, I don't know if I'll answer it quite that way, but this is the interruption.
Yeah, I got that.
And the attempts to heal, I think the attempts to heal were more based in going to church and continuing to hold on to the hope. They always talk about resiliency. So it's always being hopeful when there is no hope. So it was based more into that. But you bring up a good point. If we just had to deal with slavery and that was it, actually the community would have been better off. They would have been actually much better off because they would have had a time to heal. They truly could have been included. 40 acres and a mule was what that was in somewhere in writing. That never happened. And we can go into other cultures that different lives was done. That particular picture is from Duluth, Minnesota. See, because we talk a great deal about the South and Jim Crow, but a lot of the Jim Crow laws were being carried out up north in factories and other places. That's why you ended up with ghettos. But we'll talk about that here next. Okay, so we had the Great Migration. Well, we were trying to get away from the sharecropping. We were trying to get away from the being treated less than men, less than women. So we come up to the factories. We end up going to Detroit. We end up going to Rock Island, Illinois, where I'm from. See, a lot of folks ain't familiar with that, but that's where International Harvester's plant was, which is no longer open. They had 2 plants there. John Deere is still there. Their main plant is there. Case Company had a plant there. Oscar Mayer had a plant there. It was the little Detroit for the farm industry. When we grow up, my father had a 3rd grade education. Where in the world would a man with a 3rd grade education going to be able to make $25 an hour? So, because of that, my father was a sharecropper son. Got his first pair of shoes when he was 18. So he picked cotton. Because the sharecroppers still were basically indentured kind of slaves then, because if I'm on the same plantation that I was a slave on, and you tell me I got about 10, 12 acres, and I'm responsible for the acres, and I got to buy my seed from you, and then when we do the little books, you tell me I owe you. Now, technically, we're in this together, but if I ain't never getting no money, or if all the food I buy, I got to buy it from you too, groceries I buy from you, or not from you, your buddy at the local grocery store. And so we went to the factories. We did, that's why we came up here, to the promised land. Segregated housing and employment, which brings...